I meant to post this sooner, but I've been too busy rolling Resna procs, as you'll come to understand. If you haven't heard, first anniversary Resna came out really OP and instantly decimated the meta, kicking off the next era of tournaments dominated by a single broken character gimmick. For a more thorough breakdown of the setup, there's a link in the description to an extensive Angela vid that goes through the basics. But the fast version is that she has a passive that usually activates by her second turn, that gives around 50% chance of gaining a one-hit uncapped skill damage buff for each healing tick she receives. With full gear and 3 buff A traits, this comes out to about 150% skill damage per proc, which would already be ridiculous if it only worked once. But some setups can build an average of 10 to 15 stacks, allowing them to hit the 100 million single target damage cap, even on neutral targets. On top of that, she has a slew of other advantages, like 50% increased panel bonuses, 5-turn fire resistance down, and an M attack self-buff built into her skill 2, and penetration on her burst. And throw in some supporters with extremely good synergy, 2 of whom were released in the 2 banners immediately preceding Resna's, and no other setup stands a chance. And the one catch is the absurd randomness involved in getting good runs. Even more than before, it's turned tournaments into reset fests of gaming for high rolls, with the difference between bad and good runs of the exact same setup being over 100 million damage. And often you'll get to the very last turn of a good run, only to have it invalidated when the final hit fails to crit. You may have seen the glory shots with big numbers and god rolls, but let's take a look at the other far more common outcome. There'll even be some math later on how much time and luck is really needed. Incidentally, this run would probably have beaten even my final score at the end of the tournament, but of course the crit misses. We're running through the common route for the Slash tournament, the first tourney that started fully after Resna's release, so you can get a sense of how annoying it is to roll. I'm not going to go over the nuances of this fight in depth, but instead focus on the various failure points to demonstrate how rare a successful run actually is. The runs also require relatively high amounts of attention and input, compared to previous tournament RNG that might be mostly auto besides the beginning or some key moments. Starting off, the first roll is the boss's targeting for its Magic Reflect buff on turn 4. Having this on either the boss or the other mob you won't be killing leads to one of your characters dying from reflected damage somewhere down the line. You can tell targets early based on the camera shift, allowing you to reset before the animations play out. Depending on your defensive and healing gear, Reflect on the sheep can also be no bueno, but I eventually got to the point where I could survive it, making this just a 2 out of 4 50-50. The second roll is the Devil's single target hit on turn 7, and as with before, which units are safe for taking hits depends on your LBs, defense, and heals. For most people, Resna and Heidi can pass, giving a 40% chance to clear this check. At this point, we have 4 out of 5 runs failing by turn 7, great start. There's a bunch of turns until the next proper roll, and in the meantime, we kill 2 of the ads, leaving just the boss and a sandbag that will spam S1's at to try to trigger Resna's passive. The way it works is that for each individual heal she receives, she has around 50% chance of gaining a stack of her buff. So we have a lot of filler actions to activate this effect, with Sophie's skill 1 being a heal, the Ice Tower staff adding 2 regen ticks after actions, and Temperance Robe from the Lightning Tower adding heals after Claudia's actions as well. You can actively monitor Resna's buff icons and reset if you're missing too many activations along the way, though that takes more attention than I could be bothered with. When it works, Sophie's skill 1 would add 2 single-hit buffs instead of 1, and as you can see here, Claudia's skill 2 adds a buff when it normally wouldn't. Resna's passive is also why we use cocktail lebs in place of buff items, with the main heal and 2 regen ticks adding potentially a lot more than a Doctrine or Draken would. Anyway, the next role is this Sophie burst, which can kill the mob that you want to keep alive if you get a natural crit. The 10% chance of this happening isn't bad on its own, but compounded with everything else, it just further slims the odds. After that, more filler and stacking, you would honestly save a decent amount of time tracking the Resna buffs and resetting earlier, but I just ran it until the next breakpoint and counted them then, unless it was an obvious fail. You can see that we get a proc from Claudia's Temperance Robe healing, but just the default buff from Sophie's S1, about average. And finally, we arrive at Resna's first hit. You can see all the regen being cashed in, and here they've triggered a decent number of buffs, though fewer than it seems, since it's bugged and the effect shows twice for each proc. We'll collect a second round of regen using items. More buff rolls, yay. Next, let's see how many buffs we've collected. For this run, looks like we hit 9 out of 19, a bit worse than average. You may notice we don't have a specific source of crit rate. Well, you have critical finish on your healing items, right? The one I'm using here has 2 crit V traits, pretty common, giving 28% crit rate per use. With the 10% base rate, I've got 66% for my first hit, not bad. You can see all the other stuff stacked up on both the buff and debuff sides as well. We swing and it translates into a disappointing 81 million, which would normally be a reset if this wasn't for demonstration purposes. The Ghost's burst immediately after this can be dangerous depending on your defense and who got hit earlier, but I think I got to the point where it was almost always safe, so we'll pretend there's 0 fail chance here. This last stretch also has a few hits that may kill you if everything before whittled you away enough, but otherwise it's just stacking again. Now for the moment of truth. We cash in the rest of our regen and check the resulting buffs. Looks like 6 out of 13, which is really bad when matched with the first hit. We're rolling the last crit with only 1 stack of the healing item, leaving a 62% chance of failing at the very end, and I can testify that seeing that happen repeatedly, especially for good buff rolls, is quite traumatic. We do get the crit here, but fall short of our old record from the low buff counts. In terms of runs that reach the end and land both crits, after writing off various survival checks, it's still only about 4.5% success rate, or around 1 out of every 22 runs. We can delve a bit deeper into the numbers while I have my actually good run play in the back. I started running the game at 540p to reduce mouse travel distance. With the volume of rerolls, any little bit helps. Anyway, ignoring the buffs for now, the breakdown of the main RNG rolls looks like this. Each individual check isn't too bad, but they are spaced across the entire run, up until the end, and they do become an issue when compounded, as you can see with the dwindling running success rate of getting past each successive point. The expectation being 22 runs doesn't provide the full story though, since most of those runs terminate early and won't get anywhere near the full length. So I timed how long it takes to get to each point, and then combined this with the number of runs expected to end at each, to calculate the average time for a good run, assuming you reset immediately upon failing, which comes out to an average of about 30 minutes per completed run. Again, this is before even considering the odds of getting a good number of buff procs. Maybe the bigger problem becomes apparent if we look at the share of the time that goes into the runs ending at each specific point. About 1/3 of the time is spent resetting just the first 7 turns. That's a mind-numbing amount of tedium and repetition. And then another half of the time goes into the full runs that fail 60% of the time on the last hit. Unroll the opener for 4 minutes. Try not to get filtered in the middle for another 4, miss the last hit, and repeat. Welcome to the new meta. Factoring in the buffs adds another huge RNG check, whether you'll even surpass your previous score upon finishing a run. The calculation uses binomial distributions, if you want to look that up, or they're built into various spreadsheets and calculators. In my case, it ended up looking like this, my final counted run being 11-7, not especially lucky, but still time-intensive to improve on. My first hit reaches the 100 million damage cap with 11 stacks, so getting more than that doesn't help, and it just becomes a matter of rolling the second hit. As with any chance stuff, these are all averages and estimates, so your actual results may vary, and I ultimately wasn't able to surpass that score after another 8 hours of runs. JP is quite competitive, with enough tryhards and/or whales to cause problems of population decline, and people re-rolling this setup ad nauseum with varying degrees of gear and optimization spill past the top 100 mark. Not sure why we do it, it's truly insane, but maybe this level of madness won't quite catch on in global. Honestly, Resna should have been nerfed immediately before anyone could invest into her and the surrounding setup, because now the big damage has been done. And that being maybe triple what the next best attacker can do, even with an actual attribute advantage. The only recourse I can see is for them to stealth nerf the buff proc rate, which isn't publicly disclosed, and they can pass that off as just people's luck, like they do with the shadow tweaks to crafting rates. Eventually, it'll self-correct as people get tired of rolling, change their display name to something snarky for the leaderboards, and quit the game, right? On the plus side, only took like a month for all of this to devolve, so maybe a fix will be equally fast, or so the cope goes. Well, there's still time for global, and by then, maybe we'll have found out how this all ends. Until then, current tournament ends in a week, I better start rolling to maybe get a decent score. You can stick around for the rest of this run, which ultimately got me 44th, and check out the gear it took at the end. Thanks for watching.
錬金術の進化お見せするわ。これでいこう。任せなさい。よいしょ。
前に進むんだ。前に出るね。目を離さないとね。ここが大一番だね。もう一度力を貸して。助かりました。この服だからだね。こういうこともできるよ。ありがとうございます。
錬金術の進化お見せするわ。行くわよ。さあみんな手を出して。
ありがとうございます。体が軽い。これを使うよ。今ならすごいことができるかも。
慎重に
落ち着い
慎重に。
て挑めば